Okay, so I am using the PowerPoint presentation that you can find in my website here. Let's see if I can get to the web. And before getting into the web, let me... Anyway, it's the next presentation after the ones that I used. Okay, it seems that I can get there. And then I am also starting the PowerPoint presentation. Just one second. Okay, here. Let's see. Okay, the presentation is this one, which should be okay, visible now. And let me go to my, okay, it's not loading for now, but anyway, this is just the following one that you can find on my website, and I hope it's visible. Please note that today I modified the web page where you can find the documents, and I eliminated 3 presentations. Groundwater 1, groundwater 2, and another one that was called stochastic rainfall simulation. And I eliminated these 3 subjects because this year I am changing a bit some of the topics. And therefore I am skipping groundwater because it's not so relevant. I prefer to stick on other issues. And I am also skipping a part that was very short indeed on stochastic rainfall simulation, because we dealt with simulation of river flow data so far. There are techniques also for performing stochastic simulation of intermittent data. The difference between rainfall and river flow, the main difference is that rainfall data are typically intermittent, especially if you look at fine time scale. So I am skipping that part, but I just would like you to know that in the same way as you have stochastic processes allowing you to simulate river flows, the literature also offers stochastic processes to simulate rainfall. And I'm not saying anything now, because I want to move into water resources management. And water resources management is basically mainly focused on decision theory. So in the first part of the subject, we focused on getting the information, and in particular the information is related to water resources availability. Now let's assume that you got to, from your assessment, you got that you don't have enough water available to satisfy all the needs. And we assume this because otherwise we want to be called into play. We are called into play because typically there is not enough water. But so far you learned how to understand how much water is missing, how much water is available. The next step is to take a decision. Basically, you have people asking for water, you can't satisfy all of them, and then you have to decide how to distribute the water. This is the problem. And this is called water resources management. Water resources management is a broader discipline with respect to the sole, with respect to just deciding, but indeed taking the decision is the core of water resources management. And this is why water resources management at the beginning was basically a subject related to decision theory. And I just would like to try to turn the light off, and as usual I can find the switch. This is the screen, this is okay, let's forget about it for now. Can you see on the screen? Is reasonable? Okay. So first of all, before getting into decision theory, let me anticipate some basic principles. And water resources management is a young discipline, and therefore, at the beginning, about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people tried to identify underlying basic principles for water resources management. Some of them will look trivial to you. Indeed, they are not, and I will explain you why. First of all, let's start with the Dublin Principles. The Dublin Principles were elaborated and proposed in 1992 during an international, very important conference, the Dublin Conference on Water Resources Management, that took place in Dublin in 1992. And basically, this conference was a brainstorming activity where people tried to identify what are the main criteria that should be followed, adopted in water resources management. So let's look at them. First of all, water is a finite, vulnerable and essential resource, essential to sustain life, sustain development, and to ensure good conservation of the environment. This is basically trivial, but let's say that it's not so trivial that water is finite, because water was assumed to be, up to 30 years ago, an infinite good. It was assumed to be infinitely available, at least at large scale. So people experienced some shortage, local shortage, but people tended to assume in the past that water at large scale was infinitely available. And this is important because if something is infinitely available, then it's not considered an economic good. Now we recognize that water is finite, and therefore it's also an economic good. So recognizing water as an economic good has been a significant step forward, because it implies that people should pay for water. It implies that water shouldn't be made available for free, but people should pay for it. Now we are used to this concept, but it was controversially debated in that time. And to make a comparison that allows you to better understand the concept, let's think about, for instance, another element that is necessary and essential for our life, which is air. Air is still assumed to be infinitely available, and therefore we don't pay for it. But you can understand that if we recognize that air is not infinitely available, then we have to consider it as an economic good and to pay for it. Why is that? Because if you have to pay, if people have to pay for a good, then they tend to save the good. If we want to save water, we have to admit that people have to pay for water, and water is an economic good. You may think that water is different from air, but it's not much different, because we need air to survive, but we also need water. So, you know, the fact that we pay for water but don't pay for air is not so, it's just because air is much more available and everywhere than water. But if air was not so available as it is, the situation would be like for water. Okay? But of course, people opposed this view. People opposed the fact that water is finite and water is an economic good, because these people were convinced that water should be available for free, because it's necessary for life, so people shouldn't pay for the right to live, you know. And instead, if you have to pay for water, you are paying for your right to live, like as you have to pay for air. It's now unanimously recognized, however, that people have the right to have access to water, but people should pay for it, because this allows us to save water more efficiently. And there have been also some studies recently published which proved that even in Italy, where water is managed by public authorities, the tariffs are lower and the consumption is higher. This is proved on a statistical basis. Where the aqueducts, because we have some places in Italy where the aqueducts are managed by private authorities, these private authorities tend to maximize the profit, and on the other hand, the water consumptions decreased. This is statistically proved. So it's clear that by increasing the tariffs, you get a reduction of the consumption of water. Humans have the right to use water, but don't have the right to waste it, you know. Okay, so this is the first principle. As I said, it looks trivial, but it was highly debated. Water resources development and management should be based on a participatory approach. And this is one of the first things that I told you at the beginning of the subject. The management should be transparent and should involve all the actors, all the stakeholders. And again, this may look trivial, but it's not so trivial, because there were also, and still there are, some people convinced that when you manage essential goods like water, involving people means increasing the chaos. Because, you know, of course, if you assume that the decision maker is a wise decision maker, which is motivated to push the good for the people, then probably he takes a more efficient decision if he just decides himself. If you involve the stakeholders, of course, you increase for sure the complexity of the decision process. You need more time, you need, you know, sometimes you need to reach compromises which are not always efficient. But this is now an adopted principle. When dealing with water, transparency should be ensured. And let me say that also in general, today there is a growing awareness that when taking important decisions or decisions that are directly influencing the everyday life of people, there is an increasing awareness that transparency is the best approach because it's safer. Maybe that it's not very efficient, a transparent decision maybe is not very efficient, but it's safer. Safer for, you know, against appropriation of public goods, improper appropriation of public goods. Okay, third principle, which may seem, again, strange. Women play a central role in provision, management, and safeguarding of water. This is strange, but it's not so strange if you think that this principle was developed 20 years ago, when the situation in terms of gender balance was much different. And this principle wanted to emphasize that when dealing with water, the role of the woman and the opinion of women is extremely important, and therefore women should be involved in the decision. Because, you know, if you think 20 years ago and developing regions, we still have in the world some regions where women have no right to decide. So at the international level, when talking about an important issue like water, it was deemed important to emphasize the role of women. It's, let's say, a focused way of saying that women are playing an important role in everyday life. Okay, the last principle, water has an economic value directly related to the first principle in all its competing uses and should be recognized as an economic good. Again, we discussed already this issue. It was strongly debated. People were not agreeing on considering the water as an economic good, and still today this is the subject of a strong debate. You may think, for instance, those of you who live in Italy may remember 3 years ago there was a referendum in Italy on privatization, let's say, of water. and there were a lot of discussions. Indeed, the referendum, it was not understood, because the question was, I think, understood by a few people only, because it was not so relevant. But people understood that some other people wanted to pass from a public management of water to a private management. Indeed, the management of water in Italy is already private in many regions, so it's not a new thing. But it was detailed, it was debated how to make sure that when the management is private, there is a public control. It was just a detail. But people focused on the difference between public and private control of water. And there were very strong discussions, because there are a lot of people who are convinced that when dealing with essential issues for life, the public management is to be preferred. You know, I just mentioned that the private management in some cases is more efficient, so it's difficult to find the good compromise. Okay. There is also a rich literature about principles for water resources management. The Dublin principles are recognized today as the basic principles for water resources management, but there are many other of them, and here I provide a list which is not complete. And I just want to mention some of the principles to you. And these are not alternative principles with respect to the Dublin principle. The Dublin principle are the pillars, the 4 pillars. And then, depending on the context, depending on the situation, you may refer to this additional principle. I think they are useful to understand, to better understand what are the problems that you may face. It's not just a matter of solving contentions between 2 people debating, discussing for water. It's much more. And for instance, here you can see some of them. Let's have a look. Principles related to sovereignty, which means that states can dispose of their resources without damaging other states. This is, you know, a principle that is often applied, and means that a state, as it is written there, is free of finding the best strategy to manage water with the only constraint of not damaging the other states. This is very difficult to apply. And think, for instance, at wars that have been caused by disputation for water. I'm thinking, for instance, to the disputation between Palestinians and Jordan for using the water of the Jordan River. The Jordan River is drawing on the map the boundary between Palestina and Jordan. And you know, both of them need water for irrigation, both of them take water from the Jordan River from the 2 opposite sides, and it's difficult to reach an agreement who has the right to take how much water, and it's difficult to control because, you know, it's not easy to control water withdrawals. And there are many other contentions which are very famous, like the contentions between Turkey and Iran for using the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And they are still debating today. And for instance, there is a study that was published in 2013, February, who proved is too strong, who postulated that groundwater levels in Iran have decreased significantly in the past 20 years because Turkey is not releasing enough water downstream the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So people in Iran are forced to take water from the underground, and it seems that the underground reservoirs are running the risk of being quickly depleted in the next 10, 30 years. So this is another issue. And when the study was published, and the authors postulated that the problem was the scarcity of the releases by Turkey. There was a strong reaction by Turkians and Turkish people, and with the publication of other contributions where they tried to prove that the problem that they were releasing enough water according to international treaties. It's difficult to get a picture of these problems. Let me move to the second principle that is listed here, principles related to the use of resources, environmental flow, etc. So, there are principles which state that humans don't have the right to use all the resources, but the use should be done in a sustainable way. The principle of sustainable development, or sviluppo sostenibile in Italian, means that we don't have the right to use all the water, but we should put into practice the uses that don't leave a damage to the environment and future populations. Principle related to environment, sustainability, is very close to the second principle. Principles related to organization and procedures, transparency, decision taken at low level of hierarchy and not high level, and this is close to one of the Dublin principles. And then the principles related to transboundary water resources management, equity, etc. They are very difficult to translate into practice. And we engineers may say that translating this principle into practice is not our main task. We need the support of an economist, of a sociologist, of an expert in political sciences to translate these principles in mathematical constraints. Our task is to identify the best decision. How to translate again this principles in mathematical constraints is probably not our task. I already mentioned to you that water resources management is interdisciplinary, and this is one example where interdisciplinarity is indeed needed. Just checking that the camera is working. Yes. Okay. Let's move forward. This is very descriptive, as you see. And but don't get annoyed because it's just the first hour. In the following 2 hours, I will go back to mathematical details. So, what is integrated water resources management? Integrated water resources management was launched in 1990, at the beginning of the 90s, about 20 years ago, and it's a concept which emphasizes the fact that water resources management should be studied by considering all the implications and large scales. So, water resources management shouldn't be studied at the very local level of the single reservoir, for instance. If one wants to identify the best management for a reservoir, a dam, one needs also to consider the whole river system, at least, because there are problems related to the preservation of the environment. Downstream, there are problems related to the modification of the climate, because of increased evaporation, etc. So the concept of integrated water resources management wants to stress that water resources, the control volume, should be as extended as possible by considering all the implications, including society. So integrated also wanted to emphasize that the study of water resources management should be coupled with the study of societal systems, demographic increase, or political problems. Integrated means interdisciplinarity also. We already know that a necessary requirement is to know how much water is available, and we know that we dedicated the first 40 hours of this subject to this, to a part of this, of the solution to this problem. And we also need an estimation of the water demand. We didn't focus on this. And we will not focus much on this issue because this is already a bit interdisciplinary. Estimation of water demand needs an interdisciplinary approach involving the study of demography, demographical dynamics, involving the study of societal dynamics. Basically, as engineers, we assume that the information regarding water demands is known, or at least it's known the part of it that is not related to engineering. So if we are told how many people we have to serve with a water supply system, we engineers know how to estimate the water demand. But we need somebody telling us the number of people. This is not a task that we can easily solve studying demographical increase, societal dynamics, etc. Let's suppose that we know the number of people. What is the water demand? Just to give an order of magnitude. First of all, the water demand for civil use is different from the water demands for industrial or agricultural use. We distinguish between these three main uses: agriculture, industry, and civil use. It's relatively easy to estimate the water demand for civil use because we have sufficient indications from the literature. And the literature tells us that for civil use, the water demand is varying from about 150 to about 500 liters per person per day. Again, 150 to 500 liters per person per day. Liters people day. And you see significant variability. The lower value refers to smaller settlements, small towns. The upper value refers to towns of increasing size. Bologna is about 400 liters per person per day. So for what reason small towns have a reduced water consumption? First of all, water losses, because the water supply system is much simpler and less extended. So if it is less extended, you have reduced probability of getting leakages. And also the management is much easier because it's very regular. If you have a small town, you perfectly know what is the water demand at each hour of the day. So the management is very efficient. With increasing size of the water supply system, you have leakages, therefore water losses, and inefficient management. So basically, you shift towards the upper value of this range. that this is an high amount of water. You may feel that you use less water during your day, but indeed, if you try to estimate, if you make an estimate, you see that for your personal use, it's very likely that you use in a normal day about 50-70 liters of water. And therefore, if you account for leakages, for inefficient management of the network, I would say that 150 is really something that, yes.
But for example, in that amount, is it considered the water that we use for food? I mean, when we buy something,
yes,
that product must be productive.
No. This is not water for food. This is just, the question was basically, is water for food included in this? Water for food means that when you eat a steak, for instance, to produce the steak, you need a lot of water. And the amount of water that you need, for instance, to produce 1 liter of milk is impressive. Like 1 liter of milk may require 800 liters of water. So there are studies for this. This is virtual water consumption. I'm not talking about virtual consumption. I am talking about actual consumption. And this is a number that you can use to design water supply systems and does not include industry or irrigation. We will see how to take irrigation and industry into account. I already mentioned to you, for instance, that the Lake Canal disaster was caused by the irrigation requirements to produce cotton. Cotton requires a lot of water to be cultivated. And therefore, if you take a sweater made by cotton, it requires really a lot of water to be produced. This is interesting because, it means, first of all, that today we have to really consider and to carefully consider these issues. So when producing goods requires water, and given that we are running out of water, basically I'm exaggerating, but this is the concern, we have to carefully evaluate what goods we produce, with a priority for the goods that require less water to be produced. The second issue that is extremely interesting is that by exporting and importing goods, people are virtually exporting and importing water. And this is becoming a driver of economical dynamics. So if I live in a country where I don't have water, I can produce food, and the consequence is that I import the food. And the food is produced in countries where they have plenty of water. So this corresponds to a virtual importation or exportation of water. So water is being recognized, as I said, as an important driver of the overall dynamics of economy. But anyway, we are not considering these issues, and we are focusing on engineering, and therefore this is the amount of water that you can use to, as I said, to design a water supply system. What about industry and agriculture? The water consumption for industry and agriculture is quantified and the literature gives indication in terms of equivalent people, equivalent inhabitants, meaning that there are tables in the literature which convert, for instance, a farm, which is a productive activity, is an industrial activity, or an agricultural activity, converts the farm in terms of people, in number of people. So, for instance, we know that for a farm, each cow corresponds to about 10 people. So, the water that is needed to grow up a cow is about the water that is needed by 10 people. This is something that I am guessing. I have some remembers, but I'm not really sure if it's 10 or 15. But there are tables available even on the web to convert any activity to equivalent people. And basically, once that you know the equivalent people to an assigned activity, you can estimate the amount of water that is needed. And also, any type of human activity like hospitals, schools, they require water, and therefore their consumption of water is estimated through the amount of equivalent people. Again, there are tables for this. So basically the engineer, what should do is to collect the total number of people to be served by a water supply system, which may be actual people or virtual people, equivalent people, and then through these numbers, through these indications, we can estimate the design flow for our water supply system. I already mentioned to you that irrigation demands are to be carefully evaluated because they represent the main driver of water consumption. At a global level, irrigation explains about 70% of the total water consumption, and this percentage is also found in Italy. Agricultural use covers about 70% of the total water consumption. And keep into account that the agricultural use is extremely important because it's water for food. It's more important than the civil use in principle. Because civil use is not just water for drinking, civil use is water for shower. It's important, I mean. But also irrigation, there are some people who think that civil use is the most important and irrigation, is not as important. This is not a correct perception. Irrigation is important, it's water for food. Okay. I already mentioned that a social analysis is needed, and the literature provides estimates of water demands, etc. And also keep into account that we need a prediction for the future because the expected life of a water